slow and sometimes negative. Capitalist ruling classes, however, were driven by economic competition. They plowed a sizable portion of the surplus back into expansion and improvement of production. This would allow them to generate more surplus.
Unlike the story of the decline of feudalism, which we have already handled in a previous set of lectures, the story of the development of capitalism has had a much more interesting trajectory, even though it was largely limited in its scope. This was because that unlike the story of the decline of feudalism, the rise of capitalism was something that Karl Marx had elaborated at much greater length. When Marx began to speak about the emergence of capitalism, his primary emphasis was on the emergence of commercial capital and primarily the role of the bourgeoisie in this respect. Although Marx admits that it begins with the story of primitive accumulation, where a peasant who is able to generate social surplus within the declining structure of feudal economy would take his wares out to the market, gain some money, reinvest it in economic production, and thereby keep on accumulating reserves over a period of time. His primary emphasis was on the manner of how the intervention made by merchants bearing goods from the towns into the countryside and carrying agrarian products from the countryside into the towns managed to have a sizable profit coughed up, as it were, which was then reinvested, and how this began to feed the cycles of commerce.
The question as to why this new form of class rule arose in certain parts of Western Europe and not elsewhere has long perplexed historians, including Marxist historians. It was one of the problems the 19th century sociologist Max Weber tried to deal with in his extensive and often tortuous writings.
Max Weber, writing in the 1880s and 90s, began to argue that the emergence of capitalism has to be seen in conjunction with the Protestant ethics of different parts of Europe. And he began to make the argument that it was driven by the Protestant ethic of thrift, of not being prodigal, of not living an extravagant life, a devout Christian approach to generating value and adding value in order to make the world around him richer, that ultimately had pushed the boundaries of capital accumulation.
The argument is still widespread that capitalism arose in Western Europe as a result of the special values of a Hellenic or Judeo-Christian cultural inheritance. Arguments to this effect run through the great 3-volume study Capitalism and Civilization by the French economic historian Fernand Braudel. The analysis over the rise of capitalism has given rise to 2 big debates among Western Marxists. The first one in the 1940s and early 1950s, and the latter one raged within the circle of the New Left historians in the 1970s.
Maurice Dobb had previously argued that feudalism had collapsed as a result of its own internal contradictions. That at a time when feudal lords were willing to increase the demand for revenue for resources, the feudal structure was unable to accommodate it, and as a result it collapsed. Maurice Dobb, in his understanding of the rise of capitalism, simply stretched this argument further into the 15th and 16th centuries and looked at how in Europe the idea of commercial capital basically began to play. And here too, Maurice Dobb began to see the surge of the force of capitalism as internal to the structure itself. It was not the expansion of commercial horizons, Dobb would seem to argue, that dragged capital out of the feudal estate. Rather, it was pressures generated by the feudal system itself that prompted accumulation of capital, and Dobb argues it was this that was to result in the decline of feudalism and the rise of capitalism.
Incidentally, Paul Sweezy had argued that capitalism had developed independent of feudalism and overtook it as an external force because of its dynamism, in contrast to the stagnant nature of feudalism. Sweezy and Dobb also debated over what defined feudalism. Dobb said that feudalism was essentially defined by the existence of serfdom.
Dobb's argument was reasonably simple. When the pressures of commercialization were generating greater demand on part of the feudal lords, it was becoming necessary for the peasants to market their produce outside the feudal market. And Dobb says, as rent was commuted into cash, in order to fetch that cash, the peasant needed to produce more and sell it to a market where it would give him greater returns. And Dobb argues that this made some peasants actually willing to go a greater physical distance away from the feudal estate to maybe the nearest entrepot, nearest market town, where their produce would fetch greater value. So if a peasant raises corn and goes and sells it to the district market town, and he finds that he is making a substantial percentage more than what he used to within the bounds of the feudal estate, he would try to increase his production. Looking at him, other peasants would also want to join in. Now, everyone doesn't have modes of transport. So someone who has probably a pair of good horses alongside a cart volunteers to provide the transport that facilitates transfer of a large amount of produce from point A to point B, from the feudal estate to the market. This, Dobb argues, is primitive accumulation that is egged on by the need to make more money from within the feudal system. And Dobb argues that the success of this primitive accumulation made certain that rent would no longer be commuted back into kind. As more and more money was actually being available, as the feudal estate was becoming monetized, the estate stopped being feudal. It was no longer the control of land or production that really mattered. What ultimately mattered was control over rent. And the feudal lord of the feudal times becomes the landlord of the present times. And he has an interest in this development of a cash-based economy in the countryside. Maurice Dobb argues that this is the point where primitive accumulation manages to displace the old land-based economic order and bring it with and replace it with a cash-based order. And in this system, it was not the control over land that mattered, but rather the control over liquid wealth. Hence, capitalism. The capital, liquid wealth, which was to be reinvested in manufacture, in production, was ultimately to push the boundaries of commerce.
Much of Marx's discussion on the rise of capitalism has concentrated on the East-West debate. Western Europe made the transition to capitalism in the 16th century, while Eastern Europe went through this phase of renewed feudalism, which is often called the Second Serfdom. Marxists have also pondered over why England progressed to capitalism before France did, or over the character of the society that existed in England between the era of late serfdom in the late 14th century and the full emergence of capitalism a good 3 centuries later.
Brenner argued that while feudalism declined everywhere in Western Europe because there were certain rights being guaranteed by the central authority, capitalism did not emerge in a uniform manner across Western Europe. Brenner's argument was that the differential impact of this new era was punctuated, as it were, was moderated, as it were, by differential political fortunes of the elite in these countries. And Brenner takes 2 case studies, Britain and France, and he makes the argument that while feudalism declined in both Britain and France in course of the 15th and 16th centuries, it was not replaced by the same trajectory of capitalist development. Brenner would argue that Britain went ahead much faster than France did towards the evolution of a capitalist society. And Brenner identifies political structure of the two societies for being responsible for this. Let us take the cases one by one. In France, the 16th and 17th century was a period of an ascendant monarchy. As feudal powers began to weaken in France, as the feudal seigneurs began to weaken in France, this was a period when Louis XIV emerged in full glory and pushed the powers of crown beyond the limits that had been sketched by the feudal era.
Louis XIV was often called the Sun King. An adherent of the theory of the divine right of kings, Louis continued his predecessor's work of creating a centralized state governed from the capital. He sought to eliminate the remnant of feudalism by inviting the noble elite to inhabit his lavish palace of Versailles. Thus, he tamed the aristocracy by drowning them in luxury. Some of these aristocrats had earlier participated in the Fronde Rebellion when Louis was a minor king.
The outcome, however, was that the French peasantry now had two masters, because the aristocracy had not been eliminated. The feudal dues continued to be paid even when feudalism as a political order had begun to disappear. And the feudal dues, feudal regimes, as we know, led to the massive upsurge of the French Revolution in 1789. On the other hand, the demands generated by the king himself by means of taxes like the Thay and the Vengetium made certain that whatever surplus was left behind by the feudal lord would be taken away by the king. As a consequence, peasantry, French peasantry, was unable to generate adequate amount of capital to promote the trajectory of capitalism in any meaningful sense. And Brenner then contrasts this argument with the outcome in England.
In England, James I succeeded Queen Elizabeth to the throne. James believed in the absolute power of the monarchy, and he had a stormy relationship with an increasingly vociferous and assertive parliament. The parliament was then being guided by the interests of the nobility and the merchant classes.
In England, though, contrary to France, the aristocracy ultimately reigned supreme. So after the first flush of a very powerful central authority emerging under Henry VIII and Elizabeth, during Stuart England in the 17th century, the crown gradually began to lose ground, finally terminating in the English Civil War, which was a real pitched struggle between the forces of crown and the forces of the aristocracy.
James I was succeeded by his son Charles I. During Charles' reign, the parliament made increasing demands which the king refused to meet. Finally, in 1642, fighting broke out. The English Civil War polarized society largely along the class lines. Parliament drew most of its support from the middle classes, while the king was supported by the clergy, the peasantry, and some of the nobility who still supported the monarch. Parliamentary troops were known as Roundheads because of their severe hairstyle. The king's army were known as cavaliers, derived from the French word for knight or horseman.
And the outcome of the Civil War in favor of the aristocracy, with establishment of parliamentary sovereignty, which was at that stage still synonymous with domination by the aristocracy and the landed elements of the British gentry, made certain that the king was unable to figure much in the exploitative mechanism in the countryside. The victory of the British aristocracy, along with a portion of the prosperous gentry, English gentry, made certain that capitalist development of agriculture and agricultural commerce would increase. As the aristocrats and those segments of the peasantry who had benefited from the primitive accumulation that Dobb had spoken about were able to use the institutions of the state, such as the parliament, to bring about changes in the economic landscape. This, Brenner argues, helped in the development of capitalism.
The collapse of the manorial system in England created a class of tenant farmers with more freedom to market their goods and thus more incentive to invest in new technologies. But lords generally did not want to rely on rents paid by the tenant farmers. They had the power to buy out or evict tenant farmers. They could also hire free labor to work their estates and give them an incentive for investing in production. This process was encouraged by the enclosure movement, which transferred public lands to large landowners who used the land to graze sheep rather than produce food. As England's wool exports grew in the 15th century, the process of enclosure accelerated, forcing many tenant farmers to give up farming and seek wage labor.
The enclosure movement, Brenner argues, began to develop faster, began to develop apace after the English Civil War, and much more so after 1688, the Glorious Revolution. And as the king's growing inability to defend the peasantry came to the forefront, indeed a large number of peasants were dispossessed of their lands, which were then enclosed for wool production.
According to Karl Marx, the rise of contractual relationship is inextricably linked to the end of the obligatory relationship between serfs and lords. Marx characterized this transformation as the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It was this divorcing that turned the serf's land into the lord's capital.
And Brenner argued that what was considered to be socially a very unfortunate development in the case of England ultimately served to turn the tide in favor of capitalism in England. As the king was increasingly unable to provide legal protection to the peasantry because the instruments of law had been taken over by the aristocracy and prosperous elements of the gentry, the very weakness of central authority promoted the rise of capitalism. Brenner's argument was therefore that capitalism, the development of capitalism, is more or less antithetical with political control. Where political control proved to be much more powerful, the pace of development of capitalism seemed to lag behind. And this Brenner equates with the complete backwardness of Eastern Europe in terms of capitalist development, because there the deadening hand of political control was the greatest. And wherever political control was much less in its strength, it invariably ended up in promoting capitalism and pushing the horizons of capitalism further. In the main, Brenner's argument, as in the matter of decline of feudalism, continues to hold sway, also in the argument of rise of capitalism. There were, however, two major interventions made by the French historian Guy Bois and the British historian Rodney Hilton. Guy Bois, while by and large accepting Brenner's argument, made the further intervention by saying that in the French case, the reason why the feudal authorities, even after the decline of feudalism, the feudal lords, even after the decline of feudalism, managed to continue to extract feudal dues, whereas no such thing seemed to be happening in case of Britain, was little to do with the strength of the central authority in the first place. Guy Bois argued that the strength of the French feudal aristocracy, entrenched by centuries of feudalism, entrenched by centuries of rights and privileges bequeathed by feudalism, made it possible for them to keep on extracting oppressive feudal dues even at a time when the king was at the height of his power. Even under France of Louis XIV or Cardinal Richelieu or Cardinal Mazarin, it was not possible for the king, the strongest possible of kings, Louis XIV, it was not possible for people like him to restrict the amount of extraction that the feudal lord was entitled to. Guy Bois' argument was, in France, feudalism had a more matured form. That is, the structures of power left behind by feudalism, the vestiges of power left behind by feudalism, continued to be most formidable, so formidable that even a very powerful king could not break it down or roll it back. As a result, primitive accumulation following Brenner and Guibois would argue, did not really flourish in France in the same way as it did elsewhere, where the forms of feudal structure were less mature and less powerful. By contrast, Guibois would argue that in Britain, the entire apparatus of feudal rights was basically rights conferred by the king, who could also roll it back if he so wanted. And he would argue that during the Tudor period, during the Tudor Revolution under Henry VIII and Elizabeth, this was roughly what was happening. And the real difference in the English case was that the aristocracy was not actually pushing its traditional rights in the 17th century. Rather, it was making a new social coalition possible, with a segment of the prosperous gentry coming in, and together they were contesting the power of the king. British aristocracy was moving in a new direction, looking for new rights and privileges, as against the French case, which was defending all rights and privileges. So it was the more mature form of feudalism, Guibois would argue, which served effectively as a drag on the development of capitalism in France, whereas it pushed the horizons in Britain further. The final intervention of any significance on the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe comes from Rodney Hilton.
Rodney Hilton's vast and distinguished body of work on medieval society has been a major reference point in these debates.
Rodney Hilton argued that it was not simply the structures of political power that turned out to be decisive. For him, the actual historical series of events associated with France and Britain's political fortunes was perhaps much more crucial, much more decisive. He argues from the late 16th right down to the 18th centuries, France had engaged in almost incessant warfare, and much of it was on French soil itself. The 100 Years' War, followed by the wars of expansion fought by Louis, the religious wars between the Huguenots and the Catholics in France, all of these served ultimately to physically devastate France. So at a time when conditions were becoming favorable, at a time when the rigors of feudalism were beginning to dismantle, primitive accumulation, Hilton argues, can happen only when there is a degree of social peace and harmony. In periods of turmoil, in periods of disquiet, commerce does not flourish adequately. And Hilton argues that the reason why French capitalism lagged behind, the reason why neither the crown nor the feudal aristocracy were able to think new things was because they needed to extract more and more cash. Hilton says, compare this with the British situation. It is true that Britain fought all the while, all through this period. But after or aside from the wars with Scotland or France's intervention in Scotland, the mainland of England was never actually touched by warfare. So at a time when France progressively saw a decline in its cattle population, for instance, in Britain, cattle population, animal population actually began to grow. Also, the loss of lives in France were much greater as a result of the 100 Years' War and the various other wars that followed, because not only was France losing the lives of its soldiers, but also the life of its civilian population. In Britain, the only loss of life was limited to the battlefield. So a larger number of people were able to produce a larger amount of crop, a larger quantum of crop and products, which was feeding into a growing demand for warfare. Indeed, but nevertheless, Hilton's argument remains that in the French case, the warfare ultimately compromised France's ability to move in the direction of productive employment and productive manufacture. Whereas in the British case, the very fact that there was complete harmony and complete quiet in the social setting made